Okay. Ball's in your court.
How does the idea it's like more like how ethically speaking, nothing just stopped by the way the world used to work, I guess. But some places still now. The idea of a slave, how does it work that, I mean, maybe they don't saying it, if they were working ethically, how would you explain it that you buy a slave, and then the children's are yours also. So you can understand a person sells himself. So that's one thing. But the children, why should they be? They should be free. Meaning, it shouldn't be generational.
You're asking about slavery in the ancient world. Why slavery today isn't accepted? You're asking about the Jewish position on slavery. What exactly is?
I sort of want to, like, I don't want to, sort of like, I want to like sort of keep it like general. If in an ethical standpoint, is there any explanation if for the idea that the person buys a slave, then you also have children? I understand, and like in the ancient times, they weren't exactly ethical. But I'm saying in an ethical standpoint.
Well, I guess if you accept the idea that a person can be owned, and that's the basis of slavery, that's the first step in slavery, that a person can be owned, you might then extend that idea to saying that a person owns his children. A person can be owned, so then he owns his children. He owns his children, then he can sell his children. And he can make a deal that they should be slaves even before they're born. Why not? They belong to him. It's future property of his. If you are of the opinion that a person can't be owned altogether, such a thing is an impossibility, then the thing can't get off the ground.
We're trying to like understand how that the person says a person could be acquired, so then like how, and instead of saying like they're saying, so then children also. I mean,
take an intermediary step. Don't think about the new children who are going to be born. Let's imagine an adult who has a 6-year-old child. And he sells him into slavery. He sells him. So that would presuppose that the child belonged to the parent. The child was the parent's property. But once you think that people can be property of other people, it's not outrageous to say that a child is a parent's property. So I wouldn't see drawing an absolute line and saying, sure, a person can be a slave if he sells himself, but you can't sell other people and so forth and so on. It's all got to be voluntary. I don't see why. Indeed, let's suppose that a person, you're accepting this idea to start with, that a person sells himself to somebody. When he sells himself to somebody, can his owner now sell him to somebody else?
Yeah.
Presumably yes, because the owner bought him. So then I think it would be not outrageous to think that a person's children are his own. They belong to him and he could sell them also. That's how, yeah.
The Chafetz Chaim once said that what the mitzvah we do here affects the world. For example, he said something could happen in Paris. The world will become better in Paris as a result of the mitzvah we do here. How do I understand that?
Well, the short answer is you don't, and neither do I. How do I understand it? But in very general terms, we have the 613 commandments. The world is created on 613 foundations. Each commandment corresponds to one of those foundations. So when a Jew performs one of those commandments, he's strengthening that foundation. And he violates one of those commandments, he's weakening that foundation. Now these are the foundations on which the whole world rests. So if you strengthen or weaken one of those foundations, that has consequences to, concerning what happens in the world.
So the Goyim are affected by what we do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's take the granddaddy of them all. If the Jewish people would do tshuva and the Mashiach would come, the whole of world history would be entirely different. There wouldn't be any wars, there wouldn't be any more. So obviously we have in our hands to affect the whole of the world. And by implication, if we don't do tshuva in the world and the Mashiach doesn't come, then we are at least in essence, a contributing cause to the misery that the world lives in altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Derech Hashem says something that there will be 6,000 years, and there will be 1,000 years, and there will be a Mashiach.
No,
And
you didn't say it right.
understand that,
The Mashiach comes at the end of towards the end of the 6,000 year period. The time of Mashiach, we call the Messianic era, ends at the end of 6,000. It ends at the end of 6,000.
No.
7,000, he quotes a Gemara which says the world will be destroyed, whatever that means exactly. And after that, it'll be rebuilt in a foundation that we would not recognize, in a whole state in which we recognize. And then there's another 3,000 years of development until you reach the eternal condition called Olam Haba.
Okay, so the entire thing is 7,000?
The 6,000 years, which correspond to the 6 days of creation, include within them the entire period of Mashiach. When the 6,000 years ends, the period of Mashiach is over.
Mashiach will come tonight, it'll be now till the end of 6,000 years?
No, till the end of the 6,000 from the beginning.
From the beginning, we'll start over.
Oh, well, it won't start over. It'll be from, we are now 5775, right?
Okay.
That means we have 225 years left, period. That means the time of Mashiach can not be more than 225 years. He comes now, it'll be 225 years. He comes 100 years from now, it'll be 125 years. He gets the last part of the 6,000 years, however long that will be.
After that is Olam Haba eternal?
No, well, sort of, but there are transitions that have to be gone through so you get to the stage of Olam Haba. I'll just give you just the briefest hint. Why is there death? The way everyone except the Rambam writes, Adam Rishon was created immortal, and now we all die. Why do we all die? Because the job that Adam had was his soul should elevate, purify, sanctify his body, and the soul and the body together go into Olam Haba. Now after he failed there, the whole world took a step down. One consequence of the step down is that our bodies can't be purified. They can't be purified, they can't be sanctified, they can't be prepared for Olam Haba. So, death means the disintegration of this body. Chiyas HaMeisim, resurrection, is when you get a new body which is much more akin to the body that Adam had, which could be purified. And then the soul, when it comes back in, applies the result of the mitzvahs that were done to purifying that body. It's a kind of replay of what happened in the Garden of Eden. Not exactly, but kind of a replay. Now, Ramchal says, that's not only true for the human body, it's true for the whole of the creation. The mitzvahs, we were just saying before you come in, the mitzvahs are designed to purify, to elevate, to spiritualize the whole of the creation. And since the whole of the creation took that step down, the whole of the creation has to die. That's the 7,000 years. Another 1,000 years after the 6,000, the 7,000. That's 1,000 years of death of the world. The world also is destroyed, crashed, disintegrates, and has to be rebuilt in a fashion where it too can be elevated and spiritualized and be prepared to participate in Olam Haba. Probably not. Probably not. It has all sorts of ramifications and connections that we wouldn't accept. I'm sure there is many different concepts as there are people who write it on the placards that they show at Hyde Park in London, at Central Park in America, in New York. Yeah, what else is on people's minds? Yeah.
In the discussion of the age of the universe, you generally speaking give over the Rambam's approach on an incubation period, and I've heard you give a critique on Schroeder's approach. Now, and I know Rabbi Shimon Schwab has an approach as well. Something about from the sources he extracts the idea of time moving faster, and the time of creation until Adam Rishon could have happened at a different, or until he was kicked out of the garden, until he left the garden. I think the time could have worked at a different pace.
Yeah, but that's not different from mine.
No, I know.
But you presented it now as if there were 3 different alternatives.
No. I'm saying within these 3 ideas, but you about Schroeder's approach. Now, I've got a question. Now, I understand the critique of his approach was mainly focused on the fact that he tried to squeeze it into 6 days of creation. Why can't why is it? Would you say it's wrong to take I suppose the skeleton of his approach and then apply it to the incubation / Schumann Schwab's approach, meaning a relativity, a different place in the universe, time moving particularly in our world or our area, time moving faster, perhaps another reference point, time moving slower, which is 6 days, and give it into a more scientific framework. Now, the reason I'm asking this is because, for better or for worse, people are often far more attracted to a scientific approach than now that's a weakness on this generation or scientism, whatever we want to call it, but it's definitely there. So if I'm within a discussion with someone, giving over that approach, even though when it comes down to it, there's no difference, but is this an illegitimate scientific stamp to put on it?
No, absolutely not. You're not to blame. You hear buzzwords, and you haven't studied what they stand for, what they mean, and then you associate them with your mind. It's like everybody says, didn't Einstein show that everything's really energy? It's all energy. So it's all mystical stuff, energy, you know? And that's not what he showed. What he showed was mass can be converted to energy, and energy can be converted into mass. So it would be just as accurate to say, Einstein taught us, everything is mud. Everything is mass, you know, rocks. That's not mystical. That's dull. That's that means concrete. Who wants to hear about that? I want to hear about energy. Yeah, but there's no difference from Einstein's point of view. Mass and energy are just two forms of the same thing. Now, neither one is privileged. Now here also, you say relative, and you say, oh, relative, and there are different points of view, so I guess I can just pick one, and pick one for which this would be the thing. But there is no such thing. There is no such one. You're not just picking them. They have to be real. There has to be a real position at which there's a clock which reads the way this clock is supposed to read. And the clock you're proposing is a clock which is going to treat the first, let's say the universe, according to the latest estimate, is 13.8 billion years. It's going to treat the first 13.7.9999999. All of that's going to be crowded into 6 24-hour periods. And then it's suddenly going to slow down by a factor of 10 trillion. And the last 6,000 years are going to go at the pace of 6,000 years. There's no clock. There's no clock that in the universe that operates that way. It has a sudden discontinuity, and suddenly jumps to a fantastically slower rate of turning.
But then once again, I don't necessarily have to use that's backwards extrapolation and theory as deep as it comes in terms of how fast things moved and how fast things didn't move. Meaning, I'm using the incubation period. I'm using the idea of incubation period in terms of backwards extrapolation is a waste of time. I'm half using that, but I'm trying to put a scientific stamp on it.
I understand that, but the scientific stamp that he wants to put is that not all clocks move at the same rate, and what you need to do is find a clock which will move at a rate which delivers its time, number of times it goes around, the hands go around to that clock, delivers 5775 years plus 6 days. Now, to get a clock that reads like that, which has the hands have gone around enough times to get 5775 years plus 6 days, what you have to do is take the scientific 13.8 billion years and crowd them entirely into the first 6 days that clock was turning around. And the last of the 5775 goes around at the 5775 years turns around. So it means that clock is going to be charting time at utterly different rates. Now, but it's got to be a real clock. I'm not just making this up. Science isn't something that's made up. To talk about time, you have to have a real clock. Is it in Tucson, Arizona? Is it in the Andromeda Galaxy? Is it somewhere in empty space? Tell me where this clock is, so I'll be able to compute, be able to calculate how fast it's moving. My critique of him, the basic critique was, there's no clock that does what he does altogether. And he knows that, because in the book he says that the clock that I'm talking about is outside the universe. And he said, a clock outside the universe? Is that scientific? Outside the universe? Clocks? Made of what? Platinum? I mean, no, it says at the edge of the universe. But according to science, the universe has no edge. Everywhere in the universe is in the middle of the universe, has no edge. Now, he knows this because the clock has to be affected by all the gravity of the universe, and if it's in the middle, it can't be affected by all the gravity of the universe. It won't slow down because of that gravity. So he's dimly aware of this in the book, but anybody who knows the science knows right away there can't be any such clock. The challenge to you will be exactly the same challenge. Where is this clock which, for 13.8 billion of the scientists' years, reads 6 days, And then for the last 57, 75 years, reads 57, 75 years.
That's not such a problem, because I can say at the time of Arishain, at the time when things after Arishain, and when the things started happening normally.
You're doing theology now. I'm talking, but then there's no scientific stamp on it.
True.
There's no clock. Einstein taught us that concepts are defined by the ways you measure them. Time is nothing but what clocks do. Space is nothing but what meter rods do. There's nothing more to it than that. So you got to be a real clock, a real position, with real behavior of the hands on the clock. And that you can't do. So anybody who knows how the science works is not going to be happy.
So there's no way you can.
As far as I know. I mean, no way is one of those things.
Yeah, I know.
But he hasn't produced it. And in his later books, he went on to other theories, but I lost my stomach for it. And that wasn't the only mistake in the book. He made other mistakes, and he made tourist mistakes, and he issued a second edition recently, so he still believes in it. You know, it's not as if he's given it up and admitted that it's mistaken. And my critique has been in public for more than 8 years, and I think it's unfortunate. But I agree with your sense of the prejudice of the times. The prejudice of the times is that the more it sounds like the scientific story, the more easy it is for them to take. That's why I like Reb Schwab's way of presenting the picture that I use, identical, and I will say again, you had three things, A, B, and C, and you presented it as if there were three of them, and when I challenged you, you said the three ideas, which meant, even though you were trying to respond, you're using again the three ideas. It's not three ideas, it's two ideas. And the first and the third, mine and Reb Schwab's, are the same idea. It's just a question of how you describe the idea.
And Reb Schwab can be described slightly more scientific because you're saying it actually happened.
But, yeah, I mean, it's not really more scientific, but he's saying all those things actually happen rather than the bones being planted there. Bones being planted there, it drives people around the corner, they can't sleep at night. So I tell them, you don't have to believe in that. You don't have to believe in that. Torah's not committed to one way or the other way of saying it. Even though philosophically it makes absolutely no difference. It makes absolutely no difference.
Emotional, psychological problem.
Yeah, I'd say that to people. You're psychologically more inclined to accept this because it sounds to you more like the scientific picture. So I'm playing to that psychological weakness, but the other one is in philosophical terms, is just as good.
Quick point on the discussion of evolution. Sort of starting a basic analysis of it in terms of how it works, what are the pros, what are the cons, how it's generally looked at. Am I correct in saying the main issue with it from a theological standpoint is the idea of random mutation and natural selection?
I guess it would depend upon what you mean when you say the theological standpoint. There are religious views, not ours that are genuine, I think, but there are religious views that the 13.8 billion years is true, and the order of mutations is true, and the development and time and sequencing is all true. The evidence that they have produced of the sequencing of the appearance of life and the length of life and how many species have gone extinct, all of that is true. And the only mistake is to think that the mutations were random. A believer in God doesn't believe in anything random, and at least certain types of beliefs in God. And it means that God used procedures that look as if they were random so as to hide his hand in this activity. And they weren't really random. That is an acceptable theological view. It's not an acceptable Jewish view, but it's an acceptable theological view. That would mean that human beings are just the result of certain procedures that enabled the species to evolve from other species. The chief complaint there, one chief complaint will be that the mutations aren't random because God is running the universe. There will be some problem of the soul. The soul seems to place a radical discontinuity between humans and any other animal life. That probably can't be explained by evolution. The evolutionists will tell you that, of course, it can, because a human being is just another sort of animal. And is that a complaint against evolution? Not sure whether you could call that a complaint against evolution. But from our point of view, it's a non-starter, because the time period isn't correct, because the development is described as divine activity, step by step. Each step is divine activity. Plants are one separate divine activity, Animals are another separate divine activity, and human beings are a completely unique process of creation. Nothing like gradual, seemingly connected and flowing sequence of changes which from the outside look as if they were random mutation and selection could be tolerated. We can't tolerate that description of how it looks. Other theological positions could tolerate that position, how it looks. We can't tolerate that.
So how, from our standpoint, do we explain things that look like human beings? Just we're going to say they aren't human beings.
They certainly aren't human beings, but it's a little more than that. Here you have to be very, there's a typical problem here where you're comparing 2 points of view, and each point of view has its own vocabulary and its own concepts behind its own vocabulary, and you are perforce going to translate from one to the other, otherwise you can't make any point of contact between them. And what you then do is you forget that the 2 points of view have different meanings for the words in the vocabulary. And here it's going to be the problem of human being. For the biological world, human beings are Homo sapiens sapiens, which are defined by a certain bodily form and a certain level of intelligence. Those are the two necessary and only two necessary conditions to be classified as species of human beings. For the Torah, a human being has 4 defining characteristics: bodily form, intelligence, morality, and spirituality. Because, after all, God spoke to the first human and gave him a command and held him responsible for the failure to obey that command, punished him for it. So obviously the first human being in our description has, in addition to the bodily form and the intelligence, has also morality and spirituality. Now, my attitude is, I challenge anyone to give me adequate reason to believe that other than our species and post 57, 75 years ago, give me convincing reason to think there were other creatures that fulfilled our definition of humanity. Now let's see what that would mean. Got to find something with a similar bodily form. That's easy enough. If I accept their time scale, which I don't, but if I accept it for the sake of argument, they can find bones, and they can find fossilized pieces of skin, and so on and so on. Good. Can they find signs of intelligence? Sure. There are weapons, and there are habitats, and there are skinned animals, and those wonderful cave paintings in France from supposedly 30,000 years ago, which are enchanting. They're enchanting. They artistically are just riveting. If you look at them, they're really, it's just, who knows, 30,000 years ago. But there's no evidence whatsoever of morality and spirituality. And the reason for that is a reason in principle. Morality and spirituality can only be evidenced by language. Because whatever a human being does, even now, can be understood in unlimited number of ways, unless you know what he's motivated by, unless you know what his purposes are, unless you know what his principles are. And those things you can only discover if you have linguistic expression. Without linguistic expression, you can't know. Now, don't make a mistake, I've made this point many times, and I realize that there's a certain consistency in my not getting it across. Issue is not, were there creatures with language in their time scale 10,000 years ago? That's not the issue. The issue is, let's suppose they had language. What did they talk about? What did they talk about? Did they talk about what's right and wrong, what's good and evil, what's just and unjust? Did they talk about a creator? Did they talk about, the soul? Did they talk about morality and spirituality or not? So the issue is not whether they spoke, but the issue is, if they spoke, what did they speak about? There's only one way to find that out. You have to get linguistic remains. You have to have linguistic remains with which you can eventually interpret. There are no identified linguistic remains older than 5,500 years. Nothing older than 5,500 years has been identified as linguistic at all. So, at least at present, there is not and can't be evidence to convince that before 5775, there were creatures that had morality and spirituality, which means there can't be evidence to convince that they were what we call human. I have no complaint against biologists. They have a language and they have a right to define their concepts as they please. But no one could say, on the basis of biology, we find creatures that are Jewishly human before this time, because we don't agree that they're Jewishly human. And we don't have to agree. I think that's a very important issue. This happens over and over again, where you have two systems, and they use terms, and because you want to communicate between them, you have to translate somehow. But when you translate, you end up with overlooking or smearing important differences. Soul, morality, lots of terms have that problem. In this case, human has that problem. Yeah. Yeah.
You're recognizing the fact that there was civilization prior to 5,500 years ago?
Okay, we'll play the same game with civilization. What you have prior to 5,500 years ago is habitat, and you have weapons,
Okay, but you're recognizing
and you have.
there was existence.
I say, if you buy, you came a little bit late. If you buy their time scale, I don't buy their time scale for other reasons. But if you buy their time scale, then I will recognize intelligence, and I will recognize bodily form. I think that for that they have evidence, but they have no evidence for morality and spirituality,
Okay.
and that's not what we would call human. They're lookalikes.
So, on that note, you'd also acknowledge that the Earth could be as old as carbon dating would point it to be, right?
Okay, so now we really should talk about dating. I kept saying over and over again, accepting their dates. I don't accept their dates. And you don't really want carbon dating. Carbon dating at best goes back 50,000 years. You want uranium, potassium, argon. You want things that go back millions and billions of years. Carbon is much too fast. It has much too short a half-life. No, I don't accept it. And the reason I don't accept it is because the way you get to those figures is to measure physical processes now and assume that they've always been operating in the same way. Without that assumption, you can't get to 13.8 billion, you can't get to 13.8 million, you can't get to 138,000. You have to assume that radioactive decay has always been the same, speed of light has always been the same, gravitation has always been the same. You have to assume that. You have no experiments to prove it, you have no observations to prove it, you assume it. Now it's a free world, you can make any assumptions you want. But when you make assumptions and draw conclusions, I don't have to roll over and play dead because you made assumptions. Our way of looking at it is really quite different. Maimonides has a famous parable to explain this. He was fighting a much tougher battle. He was fighting against Aristotle, for whom the universe is infinitely old. Today it's just 13.8 billion. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket against infinity. And he said the following. He said, imagine a child is born, a boy, and he is taken as an infant to a population of only men. He grows up, and at a certain point he asks the other men in the community, where do we come from? And the answer he gets is this. Well, there are others who look a lot like us, but are different in certain ways. Every one of us starts out as a miniature inside the abdomen of one of those. And he's inside there for a period of months. And then comes out. When he comes out, starts to grow and becomes eventually to look like us. So the child says, oh, really? Tell me something. While inside the abdomen of that other, can we breathe? The answer is no. Can we eat? No. Can we drink? No. So the child says, well, then you've got to be wrong. Everyone knows that if you don't breathe for 4 minutes, you're dead. Everyone knows if you don't drink for 2 weeks, you're dead. Everyone knows if you don't eat for 2 months, you're dead. You have to be wrong. What you're telling me can't be true. Now, he's right if what he's experienced in a community of men is the whole reality. He's taking the reality that he sees, he's generalizing it, and he's saying, I'm empirical. I only go with what I see. Don't talk to me about fairy stories and other things that you've made up. I see what I see. 4 minutes without oxygen, you're dead. There can't be a period of time where you're inside the abdomen of something else for months and you can't breathe. What's the answer? The answer is the way that the fetus lives inside the womb is governed by utterly different structures and principles than the ones that he's familiar with. Maimonides says that the 6 days of creation are the gestation of the world. They're the gestation of the world. The laws and processes that were functioning during those 6 days are very, very different from the laws and processes that we experience. Any extrapolation from our world back into those 6 days as to how long processes were and what the processes were is just as incompetent as taking the life of an animal post-birth and extrapolating to prior to birth. It's just apples and oranges. And in particular, the time sequences of events can be utterly different because from what you see post-birth, you can't bring any proofs as to what there was prior to birth. One way of explaining it, which is what he mentioned before, from due to Rabbi Schwab, is to say that during the 6 days of creation, things happen much faster. Millions of times faster. Hundreds of millions of times faster. So that the entire 13.8 billion years of events can be crowded into a mere 6 24-hour periods. You will complain, but if that's so, the laws of nature are being violated. And the answer is, of course they're being violated, because what we call the laws of nature aren't operating during that period of time. Now, that's our picture. And I say the difference between the two pictures is only assumptions. And by the way, Paul Dirac, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and who was not known as a religious fanatic and mystic, also held that the laws of nature are evolving. And he said, therefore, a projection to the ancient past is not competent because we don't know what the laws of nature were at that time. And he said that on scientific grounds. So the idea isn't just religious mysticism, is not just a dodge. It's certainly a irrelevant idea. If you assume that that's not true, you can draw your conclusion. But I don't have to share the assumption. Yeah.
Okay. So when I okay, well, let's say I'm at university and I'm interested in like a topic like physics. So like I'm interested in it because like I feel like I have input, it's more like I feel like I can take and like make an invention and like have input in the world. But like when I read like Jewish texts and whatnot, like I feel like all the answers are already like done like without me. Like I don't actually add input in it. So like I'm asking, is there a way maybe I can see it differently where I can like for me that's why I like to study what I can study, because I feel like I can almost like add input to the world. So
well, I think just ask yourself whether the entire Jewish nation, including the greatest, use automobiles. Do people go in automobiles? Or there are people who say, everything's been done, everything was done for the time of Adam, I walk. I walk. Adam walked, I walk. That's all. Just walking. Is there anybody who took that position? Nobody.
No.
So how about, Jews didn't invent the automobile.
Right.
So obviously, we recognize that there can be input into the world. There can be real change, valuable change.
Right.
So why can't you do that as well?
No, let me finish though. Like I was talking about like in terms of like if I read like Gemara or Chumash, I don't feel like that energy to like I'm not like engrossed in it. Like I don't feel that drive.
Okay.
Unlike other things, because I feel like all the answers are like the Gemara's finished. You know, I can't add input into it.
Oh, you know better. First of all, you now, if I understood you at all, you shifted to a different subject. You started by saying that you had a barrier to identifying with physics. Because when you look at physics, you think you can make a contribution. When you look at Jewish texts, it looks like it's all oh, you meant not that physics is all finished already. You meant that in physics you can and here you can't, because here it's all finished already. I misunderstood you.
I'm looking for a way to...
I misunderstood you, but it's certainly not true. You know the commentaries have been written and are being written down through the centuries. Gemara was finished. What did the Rambam do? What did the Nachmanides do? What did Rashi do? What did the Meiri do? They all wrote commentaries and they all gave explanations.
Well, yeah, but like I feel like it's almost like pressed and sealed. It's almost like I don't see any. Is there any more like room for growth like with Torah and ideas?
There are new books coming out all the time. There's a gigantic publishing industry today. Hundreds of new books of research come out all the time. I'll just tell you this, it's very, very hard. It's a very hard field. It's a very hard field, probably harder than physics. So, you know, a lot of people are competing for getting ideas. It's a very hypercritical field. You have to know a gigantic amount to make a contribution. but it's certainly not finished. There are new books coming out all the time. Chaim Brisker, 150 years ago, wrote a commentary on Maimonides. Some people say he wrote a commentary on Maimonides because it was so new, the ideas were so revolutionary, he was afraid to write it about the Talmud. Because to write a revolutionary commentary on the Talmud. Okay, but when you read what he wrote about the Rambam and how he analyzed the Talmudic passages, you see a whole methodology for analyzing the Talmud. That became standard in the whole of the yeshiva world. One man changed a whole generation's way of looking at the Talmud. It's closed and sealed? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
But don't you like you need to be like a really I guess it would be really hard because you gotta be like a really great rabbi or like a really top like almost like a good door just to have like acceptance of it even like.
Well, you don't get that by by lineage, and you don't get it by paying people like you do in some other places. You get it by studying it and offering your opinions and defending them and showing that you can defend them against critique and that you have something to contribute. It's an open scholarly system. I would say even more so than other scholarly systems. So it's certainly not finished. It's not ended. There's certainly more contributions to make, although it requires some thought. The way in which they described their commentaries was chidushim. Chidushim means new ideas. So,
well, I mean, let's say you are a person let's say you feel like it is too competitive and you don't feel like you can get your ideas out there. Is there something else that can or someone can use as motivation to have interest in Gemara? Like I feel like it's I'll just be following the beaten path,
I'll tell you a secret. I spoke to someone who was a fundraiser for a yeshiva, and he said, go to rich people, You tell them, we're instituting a new program, and we'll put your name on it, the Robert Jones, Ruvain Schwartz program. I said, that interests people. We need support for the month of January for the old program that's 77 years old, and we're going on, that's produced 107,000 students, produce rabbis all over the world. Yeah, but that's the old program. Nobody wants to give to that. You know what? If I had money, which I don't, and which probably never will, though I don't want to close the door in the face of divine providence, I would rather give money to the old and proven program. It's definitely producing products. The new one may succeed or may flop. It may be not as good as the old one. The reason this is a world famous yeshiva is because it has been using this program to produce students for decades and decades. Right? So why would I be unhappy about going down the same beaten path? Let me tell you something. I taught university for 10 years, and I published research articles. I published a book with Oxford University Press. Right? There, everything is Chidushim. You know what I get when I study Torah sources? If I'm working with a difficult text in the Gemara, and I come up with an idea, and I find out that the Ritva said it 700 years ago, I'm overjoyed! My little mind went down the path of the Ritva. Even better than that is when I study the text, and I can't get it. I can't get it. It just doesn't fit. I look up the commentaries, and they say, the text isn't genuine. There's a mistake in the text. Wow, what a day! There's a mistake. I didn't make some stupid mistake. I didn't fail of an imagination to think up some explanation. No, the text that is on my page is the wrong text. So I'm overjoyed when my mind does go down the beaten path. Why is that? I think this is just an influence of, to a certain extent, influence of the outside world. It's not mine if I didn't think it up first, and I can be my creation and so forth and so on. It's a reflection of ego. It's not real. If I'm informing my mind, I think of the word inform. It means create form in. I'm structuring my mind. My mind is structured in a way that fits the way the Gemara moves, the way the Gemara develops, the way the Gemara thinks. I don't know anything better I could do than structure my mind that way. So, now you're really talking about motivation, so that's a psychological matter. It may require different things for different people. One thing that people do who despair of mastering the whole thing is to try to take a very narrow subject. Or, if you have this talent, you might invent ways to teach something, ways to communicate it to various different grade levels or to various different levels of background. That could be an innovation that can be very practical. that can make a direct contribution to people. There was a fellow, I don't know how well it was used, but who analyzed the various rules and Gemaras in terms of flow diagrams. When flow diagrams were popular in computer engineering, when I was teaching computer science for a little while in the 70s, so he wrote a text on the various moves in the Gemara and created a flow diagram for each one. He was trying to do something, since he knew something about computing, so he put that to use. That's something which you can do without being a great expert in the whole of Talmud. And if you can create something that will help students at various stages understand better, that would be terrific. Be absolutely terrific. I'll just tell you something. This has nothing to do with Torah, but I mean, I did math among other things. Students learn addition and subtraction, multiplication and division. Okay, they memorize the tables, they create the skill. Then they read, x plus 5 equals 7. Bang! The curtain closes, the mind turns off. X plus 5 is 7? What? X? I don't know, X is a letter, 5 is a number. How can you put a plus between a letter and a number? They just shut down. I don't know, about 30 years ago, somebody discovered a brilliant substitute. The brilliant substitute is, don't write X plus 5 is 7. Put a box, an empty box, plus 5 is 7, and ask them what goes in the box. 2! Without hesitation. They know right away what goes in the box. X is just the shape of a box. That's all it is. It's the shape of an empty box. But to make that transition, somebody thought of putting boxes on the page and asked them how to fill it. Once you've got boxes, then you can make the transition to letters. That was brilliant. That was brilliant. For a whole generation of students, all of a sudden, that terrible block was removed. So that's the kind of contribution that somebody can make and really improve things for people. Yeah.
This is a little, there's another question, there's a little theory I had, and I'm curious if it's anywhere in the sources.
Yeah.
It's a quick one. You mentioned some point about the idea of providence affecting different svarim that were recognized, or different svarim that came out at different times in history, and whether they're accepted or not. And I think you mentioned someone said, okay, if providence has chosen for us not to have access to this, then that'd be so. I was thinking, it was purely just, I'm not going anywhere, so I was thinking if there's anything in our sources that go along these lines. The idea that things like capital punishment, or times when our religion called upon us to do quite difficult things from a moral standpoint, if we're like growing up, building ourselves to be moral, like people filled with loving kindness, things like capital punishment assume would be difficult to do. Is it potentially possible to say that the time that public miracles and open miracles came to a close around 50 years, well, it was around the same time capital punishment also stopped? I think capital punishment stopped around 50 years before the destruction of the Second Temple and the Sanhedrin left the temple, because things were getting a bit messy. And public miracles were also stopping then. Is there anything else also to say that they closed around the same time? Because when you have a public miracle, to go ahead and do a more drastic thing for God is easy.
You know something? You're mechaven to a Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish said, came out exactly that idea. Not in this connection. I don't know about the historical connections you're deriving. I don't know. It would be interesting to check exactly what the time periods were. I don't know how you would measure the miracles, when, you know, which ones yes, which ones no. But the Chazon Ish said about something else. There are certain people who become public enemies, and the Gemara has very stringent directions for such a person. The directions is essentially shoot on sight. Already made Malin.
To give it a pit.
It means shoot on sight. It means if you can, kill him. Right? The Rambam testifies that in his time they did it. The Rambam testifies that in his time they did it. The Chazon Ish says we wouldn't do that anymore. Why not? Because he said in those times divine providence was visible enough so that the people in the community realized that this person is a public danger. He's a public danger. He's endangering our children. He's endangering our lives. He's endangering our livelihoods. And therefore he's a public enemy. And therefore when the community took action against him, understood it as self-protection. But today, where divine providence isn't visible in that way, the community will not experience it that way, and therefore we shouldn't do it. Chazon Ish had broad shoulders, as we say. He could say something like that. There's a good example of how taking what you call radical steps, which the Torah requires, and feeling moral resistance, which itself is a subject that needs to be discussed. But it is natural to feel moral resistance. It's wrong, but it's natural. Lots of things that are natural and wrong, like the desire to do various crimes. And this Chazon Ish is saying that the visibility of divine providence was like a psychological crutch to lean on, to be able to give you the motivation to do what was being asked. And without that crutch, we don't do it anymore.
The idea of the moral, that you're saying it being moral but not necessarily right for it to be a moral difficulty.
Yeah.
It's like what I was thinking on that front is that if I clearly saw God's hand, when I see a person break Shabbos, that morally is a big difference than today me seeing someone break Shabbos. Because I see truth basically in my face, and then I see him do that.
That's right.
So I think that's what sort of...
So the Chazon Ish is really confirming your idea. He's confirming your idea.
You won't know, but I thought it was an interesting point.
It is an interesting point, and I think that I don't know, frankly, I can't trace the legal background for making a statement like that. He made another similar statement. There are certain people who commit crimes, and what you're supposed to do is confront the person with his crime and make sure he understands that it is a crime, and explain to him how serious it is, and try to motivate him not to do it again. And if he continues to do it, then his status changes. His status changes to that of a much more serious criminal, and certain consequences are triggered. Now, there are directions how to do this. When you confront him, it has to be in private. It has to be in a calm tone of voice. It can't be accusatory. It has to be informational. Said with only supposition. It seems that you're doing this and this. Are you aware that these and these are the consequences? Are you aware that these and these are the laws? It has to be done in a kind and accepting fashion, not in a condemnatory fashion. Chazon Ish said, no one today knows how to do that. No one knows how to do that. Since no one knows how to do it, no one is pushed from the first status into the second status. Because what pushes him is appropriate reproof, appropriate confrontation. Since we don't know how to do appropriate confrontation, you can never say to a person today, you went through the appropriate confrontation, you rejected it, so now you move to the more serious category. No one moves to the more serious category, because we don't know how to do that today. And I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression to people who don't know too much background. The Chazon Ish was not a bleeding heart liberal, and he was not a friend to the Reform movement, and so forth and so on. He was very strict. He wrote volumes of extremely powerful and difficult commentary on the Talmud and on practical law, and he was very highly respected in this country. He was the leader of Bnei Brak. He was the leader of the city of Bnei Brak. So much so that at one point in time, his wife told him she was going to sue him for divorce. And he said, why? Because he said, I married you on the premise that you were going to spend your whole life learning, not running a city. That wasn't why I married you. Explained to her that the Torah required him to do that. So when he took these positions, he was extremely highly respected, and he had very broad shoulders. He fought the Mussar movement entirely. He fought the Mussar movement. What? Set aside an hour a day to work on ethical improvement and self-analysis and meditation? The Talmud of Ravina Rav Ashi is perfect. It's perfect from 1,500 years ago. Go through it. All of it, not selected chapters for 2 or 3 years. Go through all of it. Go through it in order. Ravina Rav Ashi took care of those things. There are things in the Gemara that will address your moral improvement. He was against the whole movement. Very broad shoulders. Very broad shoulders. But here's again a good example. What? There's no room for something new. He was taking new positions all the time. Right? There's room for novelty, novelais, which is the way to translate chidushim. There's room for that all the time. Creativity is something, yeah.
I think maybe your answer just gave me a bit of insight into it, but you mentioned that the previous example that if you would work on a piece of text and you wouldn't be able to draw a conclusion, you'd find solace in the commentary that also would point to the same direction, that there was something flawed in the text.
That's right.
Isn't there a saying that says, if you can find, could you elaborate on the concept of like error in the Torah and like what portion of error you have come across? Because I was under the understanding that if you find one thing erroneous in the Torah, that you can.
I'm very glad you asked that question. I see now that the words that I used, it's hard to say words that will communicate equally to everybody. Let me explain what I'm talking about. First of all, I'm not talking about the text of the Torah. I'm talking about the text of the Talmud, number one.
Oral Torah.
Sorry? Well, yes. When it was written down 1,500 years ago, in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is known to have problems. We have on the pages of our books commentaries that amend the text in various ways. Usually, they do so on the basis of other manuscripts which they found, and they say that the manuscript that was printed over here made a mistake because other manuscripts say something else and they make more sense. Even in the Talmud itself, you'll have a report of a prior text orally, and someone will say, I heard ABC, and the response will be, you couldn't have heard ABC. You couldn't have heard ABC because ABC is not logical. And we can figure out, if you think you heard ABC, it was probably A prime, B star, and C sharp. And put it that way, yeah, then it makes sense, and so forth and so on. So they infer a failure in transmission on the grounds that logically it couldn't be the way it was presented to them. This is all in the oral tradition. This is not in the text of the Torah. No logic could stand up against the text of the Torah. It's surprising enough that the logic of a later generation can stand up against an earlier generation to the extent to say they couldn't have said that. Instead of saying, it's an earlier generation, they were head and shoulders above me. I just don't know what they mean. How am I supposed to pass judgment on what they meant? They probably meant something I can't figure out. We don't take that attitude. We have limits beyond which we don't allow it to go. And we say, if that's what you've received, you received it wrong. Mishabashti. It's all mixed up. It's mixed up, and you have to, and then the sage will sometimes debate what is the most plausible emendation. What is the most plausible mistake to have been made in transmitting it, so we can try to recover by inference the original text. But in the text of the Torah, that's never ever done, because there you have a divine author, and there it's always appropriate to say, there's something there that I can't understand. There's not all supposed to make sense in logical terms. So I was talking only about the oral tradition, and as far I remember, I grew up in a non-Orthodox background, and I made my way in from Reform through conservative, and finally to modern Orthodox, and finally to ultra-Orthodox, fanatical, ignoramus, obscurantist, superstitious medieval Judaism. And I was listening to a lecture by someone in the conservative movement, and he made a big deal out of having discovered that the text was wrong in a particular place, and he presented this as if it were revolutionary, and Orthodox people could never take that, but we are more open-minded and unlimited and unfettered, and so I didn't know anything. I was just coming in. I asked somebody, I said, look at the Bach. The Bach on every page changes the text. The Gra on almost every page changes the text. Look in the back, the Rashash also challenges the text. He's making revolutions? They're printed. These critiques of the text are printed in our books. We know about this. Talmud has 5,400 pages. 5,400 pages. People were paid to copy this stuff. They made mistakes. Rashi sometimes finds a piece, a whole passage, and he says, some copyist made the mistake of including it here because the text is AB. Elsewhere, it's AB. Here was just A. He stuck B in here by memory of thinking that of the AB over there. But B makes no sense over here. So Rashi says, I tell you that a failing copyist put it in by mistake and it doesn't belong here. And just take it out. Rashi's comments often start with the word, with Hey Gimel, which is Hachi Garsinan. This is the appropriate text. And he tells you what the appropriate text is. So the idea that the Talmud is a text that has to be sifted as a text, just as a literary object, is an idea that goes back 1,000 years, and we know about this. Is nothing shocking to us. The text of the Torah is a different matter altogether. There we have some records of changes of letters. We do have some records of that, but it's very rare. There are over 300,000 letters in the Torah, and maybe 10 are contested, and none of them makes any difference in the meaning of the text. There are some alternate spellings of things for which there's no meaning, difference in the meaning of the text, So we know that the copying was very, very accurate, but it wasn't perfect because nothing that human beings do is perfect. Okay, I have to go to the